Hello and welcome. Today I want to talk about the most foundational, fundamental, and instrumental event in American history. Of course, that's the American Revolution, the birth, the founding, the very essence of where we come. This is where our national myths are created. This is where who we are is developed. We all can look back and say, this is what made America America, what made America the nation it is today, what made its greatness, what made its problems, what made its very essence of its being the American Revolution. Okay, it's important to understand the American Revolution was, what it accomplished, what it failed to accomplish, and why this might be the case. So I'm arguing right now, and I'll probably say this every lecture, that this is the most important 10-year stretch in American history. It doesn't get any bigger than this, folks. This is as big and as important and as fundamental and as essential as it comes. Right? It's nothing can top the scale, the size, the scope, the importance of the American Revolution. Maybe we'll find out later, but again, we all can look back at the American Revolution as the instant, the moment, the cradle that we were born in, that we emerged out of, and that we take an instrumental pride in. This is the moment we became Americans. It's the moment we started thinking about ourselves as a distinct, sovereign, independent country. And yeah, we had to unbecome British and get rid of all this British leftovers and hangovers and issues. And yeah, a lot of the problems that we have today that will plague America for the next couple of centuries are kind of not addressed or ignored in the American Revolution. And yeah, a lot of groups are given hope, freedoms, rights, and then witness these rights, hopes, freedoms taken away from them. But still, right, this is the moment where it all began. This is the moment that makes America great. This is the moment where we overcame these long odds and problems and disunity to become one and throw off the yoke of the mighty British Empire, who had every single advantage and who would use these advantages against the United States. But before we get there, we have the First Continental Congress that we alluded to last class. Right, these are the guys that are calling upon George III to be a virtuous and righteous king, to do what's right, remove the intolerable acts, recognize that the issues, the regulations put in place as a result of the Boston Tea Party are wrong, and to stop the path towards independence. Right? They're not appealing to Parliament. Parliament they view as corrupt, mismanaged, driven by bad leaders. This is a direct appeal to the head of the English state, King George III. Of course, it fails, right? It doesn't really happen. Nothing much comes of it, but there are attempts. There are attempts to avoid the War of Independence. There's interesting attempts. Again, a lot of Americans aren't ready to fight yet. They're not ready to demand independence. They're not ready to go to war, right? They still view themselves as British, as loyal subjects, and they get to take advantage of all the rights and profit and economic advantages that being part of this British world brings. The security of being British cannot be overstated, right? Being part of this larger British world is profitable. It's important. A lot of people come from England or the British Isles, right? There's these direct historical ties from the Puritans to William Penn to Jamestown. And these are direct links between England and the colonies, right? We talked about England's providing the most free laborers, right? The free migrants to the Americas, to North America than any other country. This will change over time, but people have cousins, they have relatives, they have friends. They're riding back and forth to London all the time. Benjamin Franklin's traveling back and forth all the time. And so there are attempts to overcome this hostility, this desire for independence. And there's factions within the American Continental Congress, especially when it meets a second time. And the Second Continental Congress will remain the Continental Congress for the war, but there are people like John Dickerson working and wanting to reach out to the king again to prevent independence, right? To say, all right, let's, put all this animosity, all this hatred, all this bad, all these bad feelings aside, and let's come together and talk things out. He says, a fair trade, a fair deal will be you can either regulate our trade and tax us like British subjects, or you can give us free trade and we'll pay heavier taxes than British subjects. So the choice is essentially taxes or trade. You give us free trade, less taxes. Regulate our trade, we'll pay more taxes, right? Sounds like a pretty fair deal. Of course, John Adams and the other kind of more revolutionary factions of the Continental Congress don't agree to this, but there are these additional attempts to reach out to find some common ground to avoid war. And what the Continental Congress then works to do is they function as a sovereign body. They say we're the people in charge. We're the de facto head of the new American state, and it's our job to provide the security, to regulate, to establish the armies, to tax, right, to run the American government on behalf of the American people, right? They take on all the physical, ceremonial, law trappings of a national government, right? They say that they're in charge and they're the national government that has to be dealt with. And so prior to the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, they're the guys that are going to run the show during the American Revolutionary War. And of course, they're faced with a lot of debates that we'll go into. Merely one is just the idea of raising a standing army. The British Bill of Rights says you can't have a standing army. But what is essentially a militia? It's a standing army. Well, can then the Continental Congress create a standing army? Should there be a standing army? You need a standing army, but should there be one? We're not sure. And of course, they say, yeah, because I have to. But it's a debate that they have to reckon with, right? And then we have the Declaration of Independence in 1776, right? This is where the writings on the wall. This is where the Declaration is made. This is where the independence is asserted, right? Here you can see John Trumbull's famous painting, the signing of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia. This is, again, John Hancock says, I'm going to sign as legibly and large so that the king can read it without his glasses. Ben Franklin says, well, now we'll all either sing together, or we'll all hang together, or we'll all hang apart, right? We'll surely hang together, or we'll definitely hang apart, something like that. But this is where people commit treason in the eyes of the British, right? Declaring independence from the sovereign British crown is treason. Declaring yourself to be a free and independent country goes against what the British crown wants. And so what you see is this act of treason being created and being agreed to by the leaders and the members of the Second Continental Congress. And they sent it to George III, essentially saying, we're free. Right? And it becomes one of the most famous, the most studied, the most copied historical documents ever. And certainly people know it's going to be a violent affair, right? Here you can see what's going to happen. You're going to hang. You're going to hang by Native Americans, be scalped by Native Americans, right? It's going to be a dangerous, bloody battle. Not only do you have to deal with the British, you have to deal with their Native American allies. You have to deal with the fact that people are risking their lives. And here you can see that the Continental Congress, the Americans are highlighting the issues associated with Native Americans, right? The British are going and buying off Native Americans, right? They're rewarding them. They're giving them money for scalps, Right? Bring me the scalps, and the king, our master, will reward you. So again, um, the revolution quickly engulfs Native American communities. It engulfs essentially the whole continent, everybody involved in the settlement of the United States, and becomes a bloody and localized affair. Certainly the British have a lot of advantages. They have a large professional army. Right? These guys have been fighting for a long time. They have very capable commanders. Not great commanders, as we'll see. And the problem is that there's no strong, coherent British strategy, right? How do you defeat the Americans? It gives the Americans a huge advantage, but the British have the army to do so. And they have mercenaries that they can call on, German mercenaries known as Hessians, to augment their professional army. They're hoping to also get local loyalists to join in. They aren't very successful, and are even thinking about rewarding American slaves, the enslaved population of the Americas, as a reward, right? Come to fight for your freedom with us, because you'll surely be enslaved under the Americans. They also have a huge navy, right? The British, right, from the 17th century to the 20th century, are the world's biggest, largest, most dominant maritime power, with the navy second to none. Yeah, they get defeated in a few key engagements, but they have the navy, which is key in resupplying, restocking, and moving soldiers to the Americas. This gives the British also a huge advantage because they can move troops up and down the American coast. Right, the American coast is huge, stretching from Maine to Georgia. It's a lot of land to defend. Benedict Arnold realizes after he turns traitor that he can almost raid with impunity because the British Navy will just put him ashore and there'll be very little to stand in his way, right? That's a huge coastline to defend from a very strong British force. They have a large population to draw upon. They have people to serve in their army, and they have a global empire to support it and to serve in it as well. And not only do they have British citizens, but they also have Canadian and white settler citizens, and they can draw upon mercenary groups like the Hessians for further service. So there's this big population base. Then they have well-trained officers, not great officers, but well-trained officers, right, that have experience fighting. They have a disciplined fighting force. They know how to fight. They've been fighting for a while. The army is more suited to continental European engagements than American engagements, which again is an issue. But they have good, capable officers. And of course, they're much more better supplied. They have the guns, the uniforms. They have the logistics to equip, to feed, to pay a military. They've been doing it for a long time. They know how to do it. They're not going to stop now. And they know how to use mercenaries. They can raise mercenaries. I talked about this. But there are some big disadvantages. They're used to European wars. They're not used to American engagements. They kind of figured this out in the French and Indian War in the previous generation, but war in America is a lot different than war in Europe. And this, again, goes back to almost a Native American influence, where guerrilla attacks hiding behind natural fortifications, using the landscape and land to your advantage, becomes key. And so the British commanders just aren't ready for American engagements. The war is expensive. The British are still paying down the French and Indian War. Right? That drastically ballooned the British national debt. Their money, they have a lot of money, but they don't want to spend a lot of money again on a war. And people have to pay for this war, right? The taxes that they raised to pay the previous war caused revolt in the Americas. There's a limit to the amount of taxation that the British public will agree to. And of course, they're shipping everything across the Atlantic. They're 3,000 miles away. News travels fast, but doesn't travel that fast during this era. And so the Parliament is always 3 months behind. Getting soldiers over to the American theater is problematic, time-consuming, and costly. It's possible, and certainly easier than it had been in the past, but it is a major disadvantage. Right? The Americans also have problems. How the heck do you pay for a war? Right? There's no taxation that you can really do. You can try, but very ineffectively. You can create your own currency, but it becomes worthless almost overnight. Not worth a continental, not worth a US dollar. Inflation just skyrockets. How do you pay for a war? How do you pay your troops? How do you pay for supplies? How do you keep people fighting? And how do you keep a government operational? We're not talking about a big government, but a government nonetheless that has expenses. By and large, they're borrowing money from abroad. They recognize that there's some Europeans that will lend them money, and they have to take advantage of this European generosity, not without a cost, to finance the war. Right? Financing the war becomes a big deal. There's rich Americans who are pledging and using their own personal fortunes, but that only goes so far, right? You have to pay for the war somehow. How do you keep your militia in the field? How do you keep your army in the field? How do you keep them trained? After the Winter of Valley Forge, they bring over the Prussian von Steuben to do this, right? To train the army. But how do you keep these guys in fighting form? Initial enlistment's only for a year, which means after that you can give up and go home, right? People serve out their year. They say, I did my duty. I'm going home to my farm. I'm going home to protect my family, to ensure my family has food, to ensure the economic survival of my family. What happens is these enlistments go from 1 year to 3 years, to the duration of the war becomes a long time, right? The staffing in an American army is quite difficult, especially as the war goes on. The war goes from 1775, essentially, really 1776, but 1775, let's say, to 1783. That's 8 years of fighting. How do you keep people engaged? How do you keep people enthused? How do you keep people interested? How do you keep people volunteering for a war that's seemingly endless, especially to the participants living through it? How do you deal with very democratic constitutions? Democracy is great, but democracy in wartime can be tricky, especially when you're replacing on a regular basis your leadership, or your leadership's always threatened to go home or to be voted out of office. It's a big deal, right? Time to think of democracy. Yeah, democracy works, but democracy during a war and democracy in wartime conditions is quite hard. How do you balance this against any anti-democratic trends that you're supposedly fighting against? You're fighting against monarchy and despotism. You're supposed to be promoting and guiding democracy. Well, it's quite difficult to do this in a war. How do you protect state and personal rights? How do you guide all 13 colonies in a coherent strategy? How do you get them, Georgia, to work together with Massachusetts? It becomes a major issue, and one that's not really solved and reckoned with until after the Civil War. How do you deal with personal rights, right? People have the right certainly to volunteer and to go home to some degree after their militia service ends. How do you promote manufacturing? You have almost no manufacturing days, right? The whole idea of mercantilism is you don't have manufacturing. How do you promote manufacturing during wartime conditions that get the war supplies you need? How do you survive losing Philadelphia, or sorry, New York, even Boston, then New York, then Philadelphia, right? You're 0 for 3 in your defense of big cities. It's not looking good. And as I pointed out before, you can't effectively combat British coastal raids. You have this huge coast. And despite John Paul Jones, and he has not yet begun to fight in his small little raids against Britain and the English coast, the Americans are fairly helpless against the larger British Navy. There's essentially no American Navy. How can they deal with this very large American Navy, right? But there are key advantages that are worth thinking about and overcome a lot of these disadvantages And these are advantages that the British really struggled to overcome during this period. How do you defeat a determined enemy? We see this in the American Revolution. We see this in Vietnam. We see this in the Philippines. We see this to some degree in Iraq and Afghanistan. Right? How do you defeat an enemy that is more committed to the cause than you? The Americans just have to stay in the war. They have the determination to stay in the war. They have the patriotism to stay in the war. And they have the advantage that who knows who their fighters are? How do you determine who's a loyalist and who's a patriot? That they don't go around wearing signs. They don't dress differently. They don't act differently. This causes the British a huge headache. How can they stamp out a rebellion when they don't know exactly who's fighting? And how can you punish a rebellious area without further alienating a population? Right? The British want the support of the loyalists. The further they crack down on the Americans, the Americas, and the American colonies, the more the loyalists go to the other side, the less they're willing to fight. All right? And so the British are limited in their action. At the same time, the Americans are extremely fortunate. The only action they have to do is not to lose. They just can't be totally defeated, which is hard to do. It's hard to defeat a determined enemy fighting on its own turf, whose only goal or only reason for existence is to stay in the fight. It means you have to keep tracking down and defeating American soldiers. Right? The British have to keep winning the war. Any sort of loss gives hope to the Americans, causes their numbers to swell, and gets Europeans more interested in supporting, either indirectly through loans or directly through military supplies and help, the Americans. So the Americans just have to stay in the war and not be defeated. And they can even retreat. Washington's just going to retreat, and strike, and then retreat, right? Retreat, strike. That's all he has to do, right? He just has to keep the British off balance enough and not lose his army. And of course, the Americans have home field advantage. They're fighting on their home turf. They're defending their homes, which is a huge morale booster, but also gives them the advantage of local knowledge. All these guys know every back alleyway, back pathway. They know how to get around, how to move from place to place. They know where stuff is to a greater degree than the British. It's their home. They know everything about their home, and they know how to certainly take advantage of the local knowledge of their home. Again, Washington just has to be able to maintain his army. Mostly, that's all he has to do. The Americans have leadership, right? The Americans fought in the French and Indian War. These guys know how to fight. They have good, able leaders. Again, there's some duds. There's some turncoats, but by and large, they have fairly good leadership. Their generals are oftentimes better than the British in that the Americans have at least a somewhat coherent strategy, not to lose. Or the British are kind of, we'll try this, we'll try this, we'll go over here, we'll go up this way, we'll come this way. That's not a very coherent strategy. And you have one commander over here doing one thing, another commander over here doing something completely different. The British have a problem when France enters the war. Now a localized American fight becomes a global fight. Now a lot of the advantages, like a navy, become equaled out. Right? The French Navy isn't superior to the British Navy, but it's a heck of a lot better than the American non-existent Navy. So the Americans go from having like 0 ships and maybe 5 fighting maritime vessels to having the second biggest maritime power on their side, to have the French fleet, which can at least compete with, in some cases even hold off or win battles against the British. And finally, we have a moral advantage. There's a moral advantage. The Americans think they're fighting for what's right. They think they're fighting for a just cause. They're fighting for freedom. What are mercenaries fighting for? Not much, not much more than pay. Why are the British soldiers fighting? Well, they might have been forced to, might have been conscripted. A lot of times they have no other real option, no other job waiting for them. So why should they really fight that hard? And so there's this huge moral advantage. Okay, and so American life during the Revolution dramatically changes. One, they have to supply, equip a colonial armed force. What this means is men are away for one, then three, and then like 5 years at a time. Right? If you might enlist in 1779, you're not going to be home until 1783. You're part of the Continental Army, which means that the women in the American Revolution experience a lot of freedom to some degree. Right? They're the ones providing the economic activity to keep the American war effort going. Who's making the flags? Betsy Ross. Who's making the farms function and go? Who's raising cattle or growing crops? The men are away. Women are running the economic show more than ever. Abigail Adams says to John Adams, "Don't forget the women." Well, of course, they're kind of forgotten by the end, but the women play a central role. Right? They're also the nurses. They're battlefield attendants. They're spies, but they're keeping the American economy and war effort on the domestic front going. The men are away, the women have an increased role to play. There's outbreaks of disease. Smallpox becomes a major battle, a major deterrent, a major issue, spreading with a new movement of Americans and British troops throughout the continent. Diseases like smallpox spread with increased regularity, and so people are getting sick more than ever before. They're dealing with famine, not necessarily famine, but crop issues, starvation issues, food issues more than ever before, because again, a lot of the food has to go to fight. Churches have to take a side. Will the churches work to support the revolution or suppress the revolution? Right? Will they change people's thinking? And what are the overall economic impacts of the revolution? Just something you can say nothing. The American largest trading partner for the Americans before, during, and after, well, not during, but before and after the Revolutionary War, is the British. They still still are a producer of raw materials for Great Britain. And so in terms of revolutionary economic change, we don't see much. The elites, with some to like 98% certainty, are still the elites after the war. Some of them lose their fortune, unfortunately. Some of them go bankrupt, unfortunately. But by and large, they stay the same. Right? If you're rich in 1770, you're rich in 1780, you're rich in 1790. And so the social and economic changes are relatively minimal. Here you can see spinning, right? Creating cloth for the American war effort, right? And the economic importance of women. Where's the man? Not there. Right? The woman is in charge of the household. You can see, right? Dinner's cooking. There's an axe right here. She's gathering firewood, and she's creating kneaded cloth. Right. So again, the women, even through domestic chores and labor, play a major role. Right. So the major groups, of course, the patriots, right? Those that are actively supporting and fighting for the American independence movement. They're like a third of the population, approximately. Loyalists, they're another third of the population. The people that don't want to leave, that aren't swayed by no taxation without representation, that view some of the American revolutionaries as hot-headed, as kind of over the top, as not thinking in the long term. What's going to happen after? Or simply loyal to the British crown. They grew up loyal to George III. They're going to remain loyal to George III, right? They're part of this larger British entity, and they're proud that they're part of this larger British entity. So you have a divided American social cultural scene as well, where there's two competing groups. In some cases, there's a larger economic social issues at stake, right? The coastal elites of the Virginia and Carolinas have a vested economic social, political, cultural motivation to leave? Are they going to be the major supporters of revolutionary activity? They're the ones that suffer during these trade agreements. At the same time, in the interior, there's going to be a backlash. Right? A lot of loyalists are loyalists simply because they don't like coast elites. There's a resentment of their domination, of their colonial politics. Right? These marginalized backwaters have been ignored, have been forgotten about, haven't been helped by the coastal elites. And so rather than be fighting for a larger British Empire, these some loyalists are just fighting for the fact they don't like their rich, snotty, coastal elite neighbors. And in some cases, it's essentially a bloody civil war within a colony, right, where you have these two competing bands of groups going after each other with increased ferocity and increased anger and increased bloodshed. So it's a very localized conflict in some areas. Whether you're going to fight for the Americans or fight for the British is a very local affair, right? It has major local consequences and oftentimes is embedded in local politics. You might be angry at somebody, or again, you have these kind of intracolonial differences. So it's a national conflict, and with the rise of the French and the American abortive invasion of Canada becomes an imperial conflict, right? And so we can look at the revolution in all these levels, and certainly marginalized, oppressed, enslaved groups are looking towards the writings, the Enlightenment writings of the Americans in this case, right? They're looking to see what Thomas Jefferson and John Hancock and Alexander Hamilton have to say with regard to notions of freedom. They have very interesting things, right? Jefferson is eloquent. He's very Lockean. He's writing about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He's saying, man, but this is a kind of a universal ideal. Can't everybody take up this quest for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? So there's an increased global presence as well, and even in the 20th century, revolutionary groups like Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam, they're looking back at the American writers and saying, let's just copy the American Declaration of Independence, right? And so here you can just see how it's broken up. You can see strongly loyal areas, upstate New York, right? New York City, parts of Long Island, part of this larger British world, all resentful of the domination of certain American politics or policies, or maybe they're just feel marginalized, right? Delaware, the tip of Virginia becomes the tip of Virginia, very much strongly loyalist. The backwaters and hinterland of North Carolina, very much loyalist hotbed. Right? The coast from New England through Georgia is going to be, with some exceptions in some urban areas where you see this, these increased trading ties being important, are going to be the hotbed of revolutionary politics. So just geographically speaking, you can see that most of the United States is patriot, but again, the numbers are a bit different, right? There's huge numbers, not like there are today in the New York City area, in the Charleston area. And this means that, again, more like a third are loyalists, a third are revolutionaries, and a third are kind of sitting on the fence. Right? They're kind of, we're not really sure which way to go. So the fighting, right? After Lexington and Concord and the shots heard around the world, we have the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775, and largely the campaigns in the first half of the war, let's say, are concentrated in the American North and the American West, right? Bunker Hill being important for being the first start of the war, where an entrenched American position inflicts huge casualties on the charging British Army, who actually are going uphill, right? The Americans are saying, "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes," right? Don't fire till you're too close to miss, and they fire with devastating results. The Americans know how to aim and fire. They've been doing this their whole lives. They're practiced hunters. Saratoga is another major example. You can Saratoga in upstate New York, because what you have is this campaign led by Johnny Burgoyne to isolate the New England colonies. You can see up here you have Saratoga. You can see this campaign by the British to march down New York, kind of down Lake Champlain, and through the Hudson River Valley to push out and physically divide New England from the rest. Unfortunately, he doesn't get support from New York or Philadelphia. In fact, New York is moving to Philadelphia at this point, and so he's kind of cut off and left out to dry. Saratoga is important because it's the battle that brings in French support. After Saratoga, the French realize that, heck, the Americans actually have a fighting chance in this thing. All right, they might actually win. And then after 1779, the last point is in the 1770s, especially 1779, you have like these very vicious campaigns in what becomes the Finger Lakes region in New York, led by Sullivan. And basically the idea is a scorched earth policy to take the Iroquois out of the war. And so you have these very vicious, very atrocious, very much attacks on civilians and civilian lives, in which this American War Party is going to just decimate the Iroquois and punish them for their larger involvement in the American Revolution. The second half of the war moves south, right? The British are largely held up in places like New York City, right? And Washington kind of has this loose siege on him. And of course, he wins some battles like Princeton and at when he crosses the Delaware, famously at Trenton in the 1770s. He wins these major battles, but again, they're very generally minor battles. And again, this is just a fascinating picture because it just shows Washington as a man of action, right? As a man of myth. And this is again where our pantheon of mythical American founders comes from, right? George Washington, who okay general, not a bad general, not the best general, who's basically recognizes a very opportunistic general, which is good, but again he loses more battles than he actually wins. But he can see just he's almost in a godlike position here, right? He's rallying the troops, he's holding the flag, he's riding a horse, right? He's a man of action, he's a man of procedure, he's a man of power, right? He's clearly a major founder of the United States. And of course, Valley Forge is where the will and power of the Americans is tested. We have starving American troops who come out of the winter more united than ever before, and of course more well-trained than ever before, thanks to the incoming Prussian trainer von Steuben, who's going to spend the winter training and drilling the American fighters. So in the South, you have the British trying to do two things. They're trying to, three things, trying to take the South out of the war economically. They're trying to raise a loyalist army, which they find is more difficult than they ever realized. Loyalists are fine fighting for the British in their locality, but they want to stay in their locality. They don't want to go marching around with Cornwallis. And the third strategy, which again is fairly successful, is to bring the enslaved American population out of the war, or to get them on the British side. They recognize that there's a mobile population with an economic incentive to defect from the Americans, causing massive economic harm to the Americans if they just get the slave support, encourage slave uprising, and encourage slave defection in the American South. However, at the Battle of Cowpens, you have a pretty significant American victory. This is the one, if you see the Mel Gibson movie, The Patriot, that's highlighted. right? It shows that the Americans can actually defeat Cornwallis, and they do so in this kind of ingenious way by having the front lines of the American force just disintegrate, retreat, act like they lost the battle. This causes the British to break formation, where then you have this drilled and trained Continental force ready and willing to push the now undisciplined and out of control British back. And so again, it's a major invasion, and it forces Cornwallis north. And so what you have is Cornwallis generally marching north from South Carolina up through southern Virginia. And again, he's marching north because at some point he's supplies, he needs to kind of regroup, he needs to kind of reconstitute his command and meet up with the other major British forces. But he finds himself pinned down in Yorktown in 1781. This is where the French fleet becomes important because Washington realizes that Cornwallis is vulnerable. He marches down. He has Cornwallis pinned on this kind of small, narrow peninsula. And so Cornwallis is just, here, the Washington's here, and there's nowhere for Cornwallis to go at the peninsula. And the British naval rescue expedition is pushed back by the French. So Cornwallis has no choice in 1783 but to surrender, leading towards the end of the American Revolutionary War. At this point, the British realize that fighting the war is more trouble than it's actually worth, and Cornwallis, who goes on to a very distinguished and important career in India, agrees to surrender. And the formal surrender is negotiated at the Treaty of Paris. Obviously in Paris, you can see John Jay, John Adams, Ben Franklin, among others, leaders of the American delegation. The British delegation refuses to actually have their painting done, right? This is why it looks so unfinished, because this side just says, all right, no painting, us to simply walk away. However, the Treaty of Paris does lead to a number of issues, right? What do you do with religious liberties? What do you do with this very much religiously divided country? Even more pressing is, what do you do with the loyalists, the people that fought for the war? The British demand, and rightly so, that their confiscated property be returned to them. And the Americans just largely refuse to do this. They just aren't going to give the money back. But it highlights the revolution as essentially a local civil war, right? There's all these loyalists that are now essentially stateless refugees. 100,000 are banished. They flee back to England, to Canada, and throughout the British Empire after the war. But it really kind of highlights the failure of reconciliation, right? We're not going to deal with the people that fought against us, that fought as loyalists. We're just going to push them out. And this becomes a major sticking point because the failure of the Americans to give back property to the loyalists gives the British an excuse not to evacuate the forts in the American West, Northwest, like they promised to do. And so both sides are mad at each other. The British say, Americans failed to give money back. The Americans say you failed to evacuate the forts, and it becomes a major sticking point. And some of these unresolved issues are going to fester and be fought again in the War of 1812. And there's also major limitations on some fundamental notions, fundamental foundational issues, right? Slavery. When you're fighting for freedom, what do you do about slavery? Right? African American leaders demand that revolutionary leaders live up to their promise, live up to their words, that all men are created equal to some degree, that all men have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, this is going to be conveniently ignored. Some slaves fought for their freedom. Others just join and leave with the British. Some slave owners free their slaves, and certainly slavery as an institution is crumbling in the American North. But by and large, despite this rhetorical promise that all men have these inalienable rights, certainly largely ignored, and for practical reasons too. But it becomes this kind of huge contentious debate that this moment of revolutionary change isn't so revolutionary at all. And Frederick Douglass in the 1850s says, what's July 4th mean to the enslaved African American community? Nothing much, right? Other issues, Native Americans become more marginalized and more kind of pushed out of American politics and the American experience and then the American economy. Right? There's largely ignored. The British had been, to some degree, a constraining force on American settlement and American attacks on Native Americans, but this doesn't, they're removed, they're gone. And so a lot of Native Americans find themselves victimized, find themselves under attack, and find themselves under land alienation very quickly after the Revolution. After the Revolution, there's this huge desire to push west. They're pushing west into Native American land, some of whom actually had helped the Americans during the Revolution. These treaties are largely forgotten about, ignored, and the rights of Native Americans are certainly trampled upon. And the land that they have is seen as a rightful spoil of war. And finally, women who played a major role in the revolutionary crowds, in assisting, helping, aiding fighters, in providing domestic economic support, they're also seen as problematic, right? The rights that women gain and demand during the revolution are quickly forgotten about, swept aside, ignored. Men return home and want to reassert this American patriarchy over their women, and women's rights become a much more minor issue. Right? The demands that Abigail Adams makes of her husband is fight a revolution for women as well is seen as inconsequential, and a return to patriarchy largely results. So this all raises an important question: just how revolutionary is the American Revolution? Certainly it establishes a new state. That's pretty revolutionary. But in terms of social change, not very revolutionary maybe. Certainly you can argue this. In terms of economic change, very little has changed. The American South is still trading with Great Britain. American manufacturing is very slow to get going. Certainly ideologically and culturally, there's a sense that we're no longer British and we have to kind of consciously unbecome British and create this new sense of Americanness with American heroes like Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and George Washington. And recently, right, Alexander Hamilton has been both reinserted and questioned as a rightful American hero, and should he be in this pantheon of founding fathers along with these others? And certainly we ignore a lot of the problems associated with these guys, right? That they're slave owners, they're not necessarily great people. This kind of largely gets forgotten about, especially in elementary school understanding of these guys. All right, so again, this is a foundational cornerstone for American life. This is the moment that America comes into existence. It doesn't get any more important than this. And I hope this has been a good overview of what's going on in terms of the social, political, and economic aspects of the American Revolution. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. Stay well.